A small, sleepy township, Woodbury was inhabited mostly by farmers until World War II. Prior to the 1950s, the township's small size didn't require a full-time staff of officers. The job of patrolling the city was left to constables, men elected to serve the city.
The selection process is just like any other municipal office. And the constable was always the person that the local government could work with. So consequently, constables back in my time did routine complaints.
At the time, the county sheriff handled felonies. A single car served the entire county. Thefts, animal calls, and other minor incidents were dealt with by Woodbury constables.
It was a big county, just to have one patrol car in. So it was up to the constable to sit on things and take care of it until the county came.
For decades, these constables were the first line of defense for citizens in Woodbury, but many of them, including Reber, weren't even full-time employees.
And I had to have a regular job to make payments so I could live in Woodbury. So that's why I couldn't put in as much time as I wanted to. Well, the county car would eventually come out. It could take them an hour or two to respond, maybe longer.
Constables weren't equipped the way modern officers are as well. In fact, they had to use their own vehicles to respond to calls.
It was my own personal car, and I had more or less a banner that had elastic on it, like bungee cords, and you put that over your car door. You just hooked it on, had a little clasp on it, and hooked on your car door, and this was the extent of it. If you want to get real dangerous and have a red light, you just had a portable one that mounted on the dashboard.
In 1967, Woodbury officially incorporated as a village. During the latter months of that year, Mayor Orville Bielenberg and the first Village Council decided it was time for the city to begin the process of building a police department. In February 1968, the council signed Ordinance 80, officially establishing the Woodbury Police Department. In just the first 2 years of its existence, the Woodbury Police Department responded to over 2,000 different calls. The police department began its operations out of the Woodbury Public Works garage. Officers shared a single office with Public Works employees. The Public Works secretary at the time recalled that desks were shoved up next to one another, and there was barely any room to move. By the middle of 1972, the department had grown to a total of 6 officers, and the amount of work for these individuals had significantly increased. But getting a hold of the department was a bit of an issue.
We didn't have 911 in Woodbury, and we didn't have the county doing any dispatching for us like they do now.
Emergency calls went directly to Woodbury Police, so officers would have to make trips back and forth between Public Works and calls throughout the day. The department needed an individual for the village to contact. To rectify this problem, the chief set out to find assistance. He found it in Lori Spoladoro.
In the middle of '72, the chief of police came to my house and offered me a job with the department. He had heard that I worked for the FBI, and so he figured I'd have some knowledge of, police work.
Spoladoro's job as a stenographer had made her the perfect candidate for the department's first secretary. Like many secretaries of the time, she wasn't just assigned to desk work.
Each officer had a badge number, so if something happened in a certain part of the city, then I would dispatch the officer to that area. And if they needed something, then they would call me. Because I was the only female in the department, I went out on arrests for females and frisked them and would ride with the officers to the Washington County Sheriff's Office and turn the female over to them. And this usually was about 1 or 2 in the morning, of course.
Spoladoro was the first support staff member of Woodbury Police. She built the record management system, which would be used over the next quarter century. More importantly, her 26 years of leadership set up the standard for how future staff would assist members of the police department. In 1973, the police department moved from their second location, a small office on Woodlane Drive, to the Howard Rohde Farmhouse, located on the current site of Woodbury High School.
The kitchen was my office, and I used all the kitchen cupboards for all my reports and papers and supplies. The living room was the chief of police's office, and then there were 3 bedrooms upstairs that the officers used to write reports and do whatever they needed to do. So it was actually kind of fun.
In 1974, Woodbury voters approved a bonding bill to build a new city hall, which would also include space for the police department. Shortly after, work began on a municipal building on the corner of Radio Drive and Valley Creek Road.
Radio Drive was a dirt road and ended right here at the Public Safety Building, didn't go any further south. If you can imagine, I think it was in the 80s when they finally paved Radio Drive. It was a gravel road.
The police department moved to the lower level of the building. Inside, there was ample space for the chief's office, dispatcher, squad, and even a jail cell. Portions of this building still exist, as the current Public Safety Building. In 1975, a young officer by the name of Greg Orth was selected to serve as the city's second police chief. The 28-year-old officer had been with the city since 1971. Orth was unanimously recommended to the council by fellow patrolmen.
He was a cop's cop. He was a no-nonsense type of guy. He was really interested in criminal investigation. I remember that about him. But I think he ran a very tight ship here, and I think that the community appreciated that.
During his early days with the department, Orth was assigned to crime prevention and community outreach duties. The experience he gathered meeting with citizens and working with the community would affect how he ran the department over the next 26 years.
Greg Orth was a man who really set a vision for our department, and who we are today, he's responsible for forming that. He was very progressive. He was a sociology major, and his approach to policing was really very far ahead of probably where we were at when he started the job, certainly far ahead of where we were at in the country.
We always tried our best to be good public servants, to maybe go the extra mile. One way I could describe that, it's a very minor thing, and this started under Greg's tenure. If someone called us about a problem, no matter how minor, it was our police policy to call them back and let them know what happened. And I can guarantee you that not every police department did that at the time.
Throughout the 70s, officers and staff introduced new programs to increase safety and service to Woodbury residents. It also gave the public access to their law enforcement officials. This practice is one that continues today, with officers leading seminars and events dedicated to reaching out to the community. Woodbury's population increased throughout the 1970s by nearly 67%. During the decade, the department hired 3 new officers, including former Oakdale officer William Herring. Herring was an example of the important relationship that patrol officers had with neighboring agencies.
We would obviously only have one police officer on duty at a time. The communities around us, like Oakdale, Cottage Grove, also would only have one police officer at a time. So we kind of worked together a lot. We were really like one police department, especially the department from Oakdale. We worked together. If they had any type of a call that needed a second officer, we would go there. And likewise, if we had a call that needed a second officer, they would come to help us.
Herring was the department's first patrol sergeant, tasked with overseeing the day-to-day calls of the patrol officers in Woodbury, calls that often involved troublemakers and nuisances.
I think we spent the majority of our time chasing kids, I guess you could say. You know, kids playing ding-dong ditch, or maybe throwing a dummy in the road. Of course, that's dangerous, but I mean, they weren't the vandalism type of things that some of the extreme vandalism that you see today.
In 1980, the department recorded an important first, a 2.5% decrease in calls for service. Theft and vandalism reduction programs were credited with some of the city's success. In 1980, the city was still considered rural by many. For Hennepin County Sheriff's Deputy Brian Salo, the city didn't even register in his mind.
All I knew about Woodbury was a friend of mine that I worked with at Hennepin County came to work here. He said he was going to get hired by Woodbury, and I said, "Where's Woodbury?" And he said, "Have you ever been to Afton Alps? Well, you drive through Woodbury to get there." That's all I knew about Woodbury.
Salo accepted a job offer from the department in 1980. What immediately stood out was a more relaxed atmosphere for officers.
Hennepin County was a little bit more, and a lot of the other departments over there in Minneapolis, a little bit more paramilitary. You wore your hat. They told you what hour of what day you switched from long sleeve shirts to short sleeve shirts. And I came to work for Woodbury, and I had my hat on and my long sleeve shirt, and I noticed everybody was wearing short sleeve shirts. So the next day I wore a short sleeve shirt. And half the people were wearing long sleeve shirts. And I asked Bill Herring, who was a sergeant at the time, I said, "What day do you switch over?" Assuming that was standard. And I remember his response as, "If it's warm out, we wear short sleeve shirts. If it's cold out, we wear long sleeve shirts." And I thought, well, this has a lot of common sense attached to it. So I remember that, and that impressed me.
Projected data seems to indicate the need for more staffing in 1980. Salo was expected to serve a city of 13,000.
So when we found out the population was only 10,283, I thought I was potentially going to get laid off. They kept me.
A recession had slowed growth to a trickle in Woodbury. A new officer wouldn't be hired again until 1986. Being the lowest on the totem pole, Brian Salo spent the next 6 years on the dog shift.
And the last one on the list was the weekend night shift. So I worked Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, dog shift, which was 8 p.m. till 6 a.m. and then at one point it changed, I think, to 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. But I worked every weekend and the weekend nights. And that's just the way the schedule was, and that's what you did.
During the mid-1980s, the department revamped its training program. FTO, or Field Training Officers, were department members trained to introduce new cops to Woodbury and the department's operations. New hires would go through written materials such as state laws and local ordinances, while being assisted by a training officer. Throughout the progression of training, more responsibility is given to the officer. At the end of the process, a new recruit goes through a 2-week evaluation with no assistance. Although the length of the program has changed, the FTO process is still used by the department during the first year of an officer's career. By 1986, the effects of the recession began to wear off. To respond, Woodbury requested 2 new officers. In June, Woodbury Police hired their first female officer, Sherry Cook.
Woodbury was seen as a progressive department, and so they were attempting to hire minority groups.
On her way to be sworn in by the council, Cook tuned into KDWB, which was then located in Woodbury. She was surprised to hear the DJ mention the police department.
And they were talking about how one of the Woodbury officers they felt was harassing one of the DJs, and it kind of keyed me into listening because I thought, oh, Woodbury, I'm going to be working there. That's cool that they're talking about Woodbury. And then they said, well, maybe all that will change now that they've hired their first female officer. I was not really thinking too much about it, and then they said my name. And I was driving down the road with my Woodbury police uniform on for the first time, had the patch, facing out. And I felt like a spotlight came down on me, and I kind of looked around, and there was a woman in a car next to me, and she gave me the big thumbs up.
The spotlight didn't let up on the drive. When Cook arrived in front of City Hall, she saw several local media outlets were there also.
I was thinking, I wonder what's going on. Looks like, fun city to work in because there's so much going on. And it turns out what was going on was that they were hiring their first female officer. And so the cameras were there for me when I got sworn in. So I felt a tiny little bit of pressure at that point to be successful.
Cook quickly became an important member of the police department. Shortly after being hired, she became an investigator for the city. In 1990, Chief Orth requested that Cook begin teaching DARE, a new curriculum designed to teach elementary students the dangers of illegal drugs. She excelled, and the next year, the Minnesota BCA hired her to begin training officers across the state to teach the curriculum. The 1980s were drawing to a close, and with it came a period of growth that would change the trajectory of the city for the next 25 years. Woodbury PD's first computer came in 1987. Support staff at the time began the long, arduous process of transferring nearly 20 years of files to the new computer system.
Our first computer had 30 megabytes of storage in it. My camera card that I have now has 64 gigs, and we thought we'd put all the information in the world in there.
2 years later, residents voted to construct a new city hall adjacent to the existing building. The current city hall would be remodeled to house only public safety operations. In 1990, the Woodbury Public Safety Building reopened as city staff moved next door. Housing came to Woodbury in earnest in the late 1980s and early 90s. When police officer Lee Vagg started in 1989, it was clear that Woodbury was no longer a rural town or bedroom community. It was on track to become the second largest city in Washington County.
I think when I first started, the sign said population 10,000, but in reality the population was 20,000 in about 1990. And then every year after that, there was just this planful but exciting growth that was happening throughout the city. And so that's what it was all about, was just knowing that and being good with that change and being able to grow with the community, literally.
Tamarack Village and other shopping centers drew in customers from I-94 into Woodbury. While great for the economy, it presented challenges for the police department.
Bad checks, shoplifting, all those types of things now became probably our biggest crime.
Officers from Woodbury would respond valiantly.
We sent officers to training to handle retail crime. Our investigations unit had officers who specialized in retail crime. It really made an impact.
Currently, specific officers are trained to serve on metro-wide crime details, and some investigators work exclusively on retail cases. Calls for service increased significantly, and not just police calls. Medical emergencies, not surprisingly, increased with the population. In 1990, the City Council formed a task force to determine what could be done to improve response time in Woodbury.
And the decision was made to go to a police officer paramedic program. That took several years to implement because we had to hire a lot of officers.
11 to be exact. After the new cross-trained police officer paramedics were hired, an additional 6 officers went back to school to learn paramedic skills.
Amazing things were done by police paramedics. You know, many times I'd be in a person's house with someone in full arrest and the paramedics could bring them back. And to have someone talking and then essentially dead for a few minutes and then say what happened after they're converted and they come back. That's impressive to watch.
Response times quickened. Save rates increased too.
Most of the paramedics were police officers. That allowed a tremendous response time, and we had a very, very good save rate on heart issues. Our save rate back then was 50%, and I think the national average at the time was 5%. Once again, it was because of that response time.
With officers from all 3 branches together and trained under one roof, the transition to a public safety department was complete. Before the widespread availability of the internet, police officers had limited access to some of the most common items they use today. Cell phones came to the department in the mid-1990s.
And the first telephones we had were the old brick phones, they were called. They were wired into the car, and they were in a case about like that.
In fact, squad cars had been very low-tech throughout the first 30 years of the police department's history.
We had no computers. It was just basically a radio stack, flashy lights, and we had a notepad. We wrote things down. When we tried to figure out how to get places, we had a map book. We'd pull over the side of the road and we'd figure out where we're going, which was always a challenge because there were new roads coming in, being cut in all the time, and you hoped your map book was up to date, and it generally wasn't, but you kind of had a rough idea as to where it was because of the block numbers and things. So that was what it was like in the early days.
By the mid-2000s, computers were added to squad vehicles.
I remember when I first started, we'd have what we called MDTs, which were old-fashioned computers that took a while to boot up and warm up, and now we have laptops in our squad cars.
Modern squad laptops have internet accessibility, allowing Woodbury police officers the ability to talk back and forth through text, read reports on suspects, and look up addresses. In 2002, Chief Greg Orth retired. Then Deputy Public Safety Director William Herring was promoted to the role of Public Safety Director, overseeing the operations of police, fire, and EMS.
I got to be in the community more when I was the public safety director or police chief. I think there was more involvement in the community as the police chief than what there was as a police officer.
Throughout the years, the emphasis that Orth had placed on community policing and outreach was still important. Back in 1993, the police department began sponsoring an Explorer program as a way to reach out to young residents. Woodbury local Omar Maklad joined the group in 2002.
So I actually started with Woodbury PD when I was 16 years old as a police explorer, which is kind of a high school age program that lets you figure out what law enforcement is all about. And I've stuck with Woodbury ever since.
Young men and women learn the basics of law enforcement, including state laws and local ordinances, and compete in challenges based on real police scenarios.
You'd have class once a week where you'd learn different functions of the police department. You'd get to know some of the officers. Every once in a while you get to do a ride-along.
For Maklad, the program introduced him to mentors who would guide him towards a career as a police officer.
I remember the first ride-along that I did with Sergeant Billmeyer. We went to a shoplifting call, and there was a weapon involved or something like that, and we all ran from the report room into the squad cars and raced over to the store, and the adrenaline rush that came with that, just watching the whole situation unfold, I was hooked. I mean, I knew that from that point I was going to be a cop. I became a CSO after that, a community service officer, helping out the officers on the street, and then moved to patrol officer and eventually promoted to sergeant.
The Explorers program served another important function, introducing new potential candidates to the Public Safety Department. Sergeant Maklad is one of nearly a dozen Woodbury Explorers who have moved into a full-time officer role since the program's inception.
We think we have a really good thing going here, and if we get somebody in an entry-level position, even an internship, when they're young and still trying to figure out what they want to do, it gives them a chance to try us out. It gives us a chance to try them out as an employee. And if it turns out they want to do something different, they go on a different path, that's fine, that's good. I think that's part of our role.
Being a progressive and forward-thinking department, Woodbury Police has been hiring people of various backgrounds for over 30 years.
As our population increased, what Woodbury looks like has changed, and we've tried to keep up with that pace as well, so that our workforce represents our community in every way.
Sergeant Lee Vegg took the reins as Public Safety Director in 2007. Continued shifts in population and demographics caused the Public Safety Department to restaff and restructure some of its operations. That year, 11 officers were trained or hired to serve in firefighter police officer roles.
You know, looking back on how we do business and the fact that we're really a public safety department, it's almost hard to remember when we weren't that. Over the years, it's just been this very steady, gradual model from separate services to coming together as one service and then truly getting to the point where we're cross-training people in these different areas. It's just been a kind of a slow evolution of how we do things.
Woodbury's implementation of a true public safety department is one of the largest in the state. Additionally, they boast one of the quickest response times for the entire metro area. For better or worse, the modern state of policing has changed.
It sounds like you're familiar with the whole locking.
Woodbury Police's newest officer, Ashley Laval, has seen changes during her 9 years of policing in Minnesota.
There's been quite a shift since social media has taken such a big part in society. The responses to different kinds of scenarios and calls are more criticized, whether that be good or bad. I think people are just know more about what's going on.
Evolving with the times, Woodbury has provided additional training to its officers.
There's been a big shift as far as really focusing more on community relations and de-escalation techniques and learning more about different kinds of people and how they're affected by society and things like that.
In 2018, the department will add new technology, specifically body cameras to all officers, providing additional transparency to its residents. Luckily, because of the leadership of some of the department's founding members, Woodbury is leaps and bounds ahead of others in terms of community policing. Programs like Nights Unite, Coffee with a Cop, and Safety Camp give residents a chance to truly interact with and meet public safety staff.
Any opportunity to connect with the community during a non-emergency situation in particular is important. It's important for new officers, it's important for veteran officers. It keeps us grounded. It reminds us why we're here.
Today, Woodbury Police and the Public Safety Department stand apart from surrounding communities.
The leadership that Woodbury Public Safety has is very well known around our county and around the state. That's what really impressed me most about Woodbury, and that's what I really wanted to figure out when I was looking at applying here. I wasn't interested in going anywhere else.
Well, I hope that our reputation is that we're professional. I think everybody's done their best to represent our agency with the utmost respect and professionalism, and I hope that future officers maintain that for us.
And over the course of 50 years, the police department has made a difference in the lives of the residents of Woodbury, Minnesota.